Post-truth was the Oxford English Dictionary Word of the Year for 2016, and that's why it's so prominent now. There are a lot of reasons why it should have been chosen for that honor, as it were, and that is because of issues having to do with the way in which expert authority has been challenged and in a way defied over the last 12 months, including things like the election of Donald Trump as president and Brexit in the UK and the rise of various populist movements against, in all these cases, against the way in which pollsters and experts have thought would happen. However, I don't see the post-truth phenomena quite in this way. I kind of understand it in those terms, and I speak as someone who, in fact, was voting for Hillary Clinton as far back as 2008, actually, against Obama. So I'm not someone who, in a way, was kind of on this bandwagon in some fashion, but nevertheless, I understand the phenomenon, and I think it reflects a kind of deeper issue that is very much present in the history, in Western intellectual history, and so people who think this is just a phenomenon of the present, I think have got it wrong. Okay, so in other words, I see post-truth as something that's always been very much with us. And what this word does is it enables us to crystallize what we're talking about. And what I think post-truth is really getting at is that there's a distinction between talking about what is true and false, which is fine, and then talking about the conditions for the possibility of what is true and false. Okay? In philosophy, we call the first issue a first-order issue. In other words, we're talking about a kind of world where everybody already shares common assumptions, and then in terms of those common assumptions, we can say this is true, this is false, etc. But there's also second-order issues, which has to do with the world where we haven't agreed on the assumptions. And in a sense, what the second order is about establishing the assumptions. And it's in terms of establishing the assumptions, in terms of that, then you can talk about what's true and what's false. And the post-truth world is about that. It's about the second thing. And this is a kind of thing that Kant called transcendental conditions, right? And he talked about in terms of the possibility of what is true and false. And this is what the post-truth condition brings out very much into the open, into public display, okay? It's the idea that what we're talking about in politics, but in the world generally, is not simply what is true and false, but it's about the conditions under which what one decides is true and false. Okay? And so then what's interesting about the post-truth situation is that you're in a sense acknowledging this, and you're actually having a fight over what are the conditions under what's true and false. So the whole point about fake news, for example, as a rhetorical token that, let's say, that Donald Trump uses, is the fact that his opponents use it as well. Right? Both sides accuse each other of providing fake news. Donald Trump says this of the New York Times, right? And the New York Times will say this about Donald Trump's press spokesman, Sean Spicer. Okay, so you end up, and what is this about? This is about actually a contest, not over what is true, but over the conditions under which what is true and false is decided. Okay? Now, this kind of idea that we should be talking about the conditions under which true and false is decided, that this is really the issue, is something that is actually very much part of the origin of Western philosophy if you associate that with Plato. Okay, Plato is the ultimate post-truth guy. Okay, so in this respect, we have always been post-truth. Now, Plato, what I'm referring to here, primarily is in the Republic, And so the Republic is this dialogue that Plato has. It's his main work. Everybody knows him for this. And he's talking about how do you set up the just society. Now, the interesting thing about how you set up the just society is that you end up having a kind of divided view about what people should know, basically. On the one hand, you have what Plato calls the philosopher kings. And those people who are trained in a very special kind of way from an early age, they're specially selected because of their talent, and they're trained in the abstract subjects of mathematics and philosophy and music and astronomy, right? So in other words, they're not focused primarily on what other people think, but they're focused on the kind of larger, more cosmic kind of things. These people are the real, you might say, they're the people who really know the truth in some sense. And it's especially in terms of a truth for governance. But they're secluded. They're on one side. Plato doesn't believe that everyone should know this, because he believes that if people actually, ordinary people actually knew about this kind of stuff, this would drive them crazy. It would show that the world is open to all of these kinds of possibilities which ordinary people cannot deal with. And that most people, according to Plato, the only reality they can deal with is the one they directly experience. And so it becomes important then that the rest of the society actually are basically, the kinds of knowledge they should have is the kind of knowledge that's appropriate for the kind of lives that they lead. Now, what this ends up meaning is that from the standpoint of truth, these people know a kind of false way of the world. But it's a false way of the world that works and actually enables the people who know the true way of the world to make a better world for all of them put together. Okay? That is the point of Plato's Republic, and that's the kind of post-truth conception. So the post-truth sensibility in Western philosophy ultimately comes from Plato's Republic. This is often seen as kind of the founding document of Western political philosophy, but it's also a document in social epistemology, that is to say, in the way in which we understand how knowledge should be organized and distributed socially. And here the issue boils down to what is it that people should know in order to lead their lives? And for Plato, there was a kind of open question about the extent to which everyone should actually know the truth, okay? And who should actually be in a position, therefore, to decide how the truth is actually known. And for Plato, this amounted to drawing a very strong distinction between those who should be in control of the conditions under which the true and the false are determined, versus those who should just be in a position of receiving that. In other words, they should be just told what is true and false. And for Plato, this is a very clear distinction. It's one that I think is quite recognizable throughout the entire history of the West, if not humanity generally, namely a kind of sense of authority based on the knows and the know-nots, you might say. Who knows and who doesn't know. And for Plato, the people who should be setting the conditions on the possibility of what is true and false are those who are educated in the most abstract forms of knowledge. That is to say, the forms of knowledge that command the most universal kind of coverage. And so what he meant here was mathematics, what we would now call physics, astronomy, music, right? These kinds of very abstract and universal kinds of forms of understanding the world that aren't dependent on very particular material conditions. On the other hand, the rest of humanity ought to know about just the forms of knowledge that are relevant to kinds of lives and experiences that they have. And they should be as it were, reinforced in that form of knowledge. So they should be told the sorts of things that will enable them to live as they have in the past. And for Plato, that was a formula for a stable society. And what that meant was that, strictly speaking, from the standpoint of the people who were what Plato called the philosopher kings, the people who knew the abstract form of knowledge, what the rest of the population knew was false, in the sense that people were being led to believe that the only things that there were in the world were the things that were directly tied to their material conditions. In other words, there was nothing beyond that. There was nothing that they could go beyond, they could aspire to, that they could think about. And so for Plato, one of the first things he did, in a sense, in establishing this kind of post-truth order, the original post-truth order, where only a certain group of people control what is true and false and everyone else just sort of believes it, is that there's a strong fact-fiction distinction, okay? Because one of the things that makes post-truth work, it seems to me, is the idea that if you've got people who believe that the world needs to be a certain way, and so regardless of where I am in the world, that the world has to operate this way, then I have a strong fact-fiction distinction. And so when I think about alternative ways in which the world could be, I think that's just fiction. That's not really the way the world could be. Plato was very much about enforcing this kind of idea. And it's an idea, of course, that's very much with us today and whatever, but it's a kind of post-truth idea. And I think the way you can see how post-truth this idea is, that is very insistent on a fact-fiction distinction, is the kind of people who Plato thought were his biggest enemies in his own day. And they were the playwrights, okay? The playwrights, the people who did drama, okay? Because what did the people who write plays do and perform plays? And you have to think about ancient Athens as a place where the plays were performed largely in the same kinds of public spaces in which politics was normally conducted. So in other words, from a physical standpoint, there wasn't a strong distinction between fact and fiction, right? That had to be manufactured in some kind of way, because actually the places were kind of the same. But what Plato was objecting to in the playwrights was the fact that here we have people who are, in their performances, creating a kind of alternative reality, which looks different from the reality they were normally taught to be true and all the rest of it. And it sort of went outside of what was the accepted kind of understanding of what is true and false. And Plato thought such people were dangerous, primarily because, especially if the plays were good and were very realistic, as we might say, whereby people kind of sort of think what's going on the stage is something that could well go on outside the stage. And then the fact-fiction reality gets blurred, and at that point Plato thought chaos would ensue, right? That you would have a social disturbances, all the rest of it. And of course, in the history of the West, there's full of this kind of concern. This is not new. This is not just unique to Plato. It's throughout the history of the West. And the thing that's interesting about that is that this demonstrates that both Plato and the playwrights understood each other perfectly, in the sense that both realized they were both acting in a post-truth world, because what they are doing is they are competing over the conditions under which true and false are decided, right? They're not taking, neither side is taking for granted what is true and false. Both are competing over determining the conditions under which true and false is decided. So in this respect, you might see the kind of thing that the playwright is doing as a kind of alternative government, a kind of alternative way of organizing the society. And this is exactly what Plato found problematic about playwrights, okay? And one of the things that Aristotle who was Plato's student, did that kind of, you might say, put a lid, right, contained this kind of sensibility, was in his own kind of view about drama. Because one of the things that Aristotle says about drama, which is very pertinent to the history of aesthetics and so forth, is that if you've got a well-formed play, it reaches a natural closure, a conclusion. There is what Aristotle calls a catharsis, where all the emotions, all the issues that the audience is building up alongside of the actors disappears. And then people go back to normal. And then they leave the theater and they're just the way they were before they entered the theater. And for Aristotle, this is the way in which plays ought to be produced. But what this suggests is that Aristotle is including the play under the category of fiction. It is false. And so the whole point is, you know that what's happening in the theater stays in the theater. It doesn't migrate from the theater. And this was the issue that Plato was concerned about. And the point about the post-truth world in which we live now is that this issue that Plato was concerned about in terms of banning the playwrights, from public exposure, has been revealed, is back out in the open again. It's become a live issue again. And this is why you see people like Donald Trump, and you can go back 30 years earlier with Ronald Reagan in the US White House. These are basically actors, performance artists of a certain kind who end up becoming very prominent, largely because the virtues that they displayed on the stage as actors are seen as persuasive, as appropriate for the political arena. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Plato was against, okay? And this is why he banned the playwrights. This is the post-world we're in now. Post-truth world we're in now is this kind of a world, which Plato, I think, anticipated perfectly, understood exactly how it worked, and explained why he wanted to remove the playwrights from the Republic.